Hi, this is Jesse Liberty from Microsoft, and what we're going to do today is create another simple Silverlight project, but this time we're going to look very carefully at how Silverlight XAML and the JavaScript and the HTML work together in a project that I think we'll call What's Inside. It's one thing to know that when you press the brake pedal in your car, it slows the car down. That's all you need to know until the day that you press the brake pedal and it doesn't. And I think that there is the potential for a fair amount of confusion about the interaction between the JavaScript, the HTML, and the XAML. And there's no better place to look at that interaction than in the simple application that's created for you by using the template provided for Visual Studio 2005 and 2008, and looking at that in sufficient detail to get a good idea of how the application is brought to life and how the application works. Just as a reminder, when you run this application, what happens is that a browser is brought up and a button is displayed that says "Click Me," and when you hover over it, there is an indication by a change in the color of the button. When you click on it, it darkens, and when you release the mouse, a window pops up that says that it was clicked. But how does all of that work? Well, it's easy to have a gut feeling for how all of that works, but really there's quite a bit of interaction going on here between three different pieces, and that's what I'd like to take a look at. We have default HTML, and behind that is a JavaScript file. We have scene.xaml, which is our XAML file, and behind that is a JavaScript file. And then we have Silverlight.js, which is provided for us. Now, Silverlight.js is designed to be used as is, and its job is to figure out whether your browser supports the Silverlight plugin and do all the necessary work of adapting Silverlight for your platform and plugin, and it's not necessarily created to be human readable or adjustable. So we'll close that and assume that that is, in fact, more or less magic. Let's start with default.html because that's where our program begins. Default.html, we can look just at the source view. It's fairly straightforward, and yet there is a few things going on that are worth knowing. One thing is that in the header section is a script block that includes 3 JS files, and those are the 3 that we already identified as the 3 that are in the program. That is the JS file that supports default, the JS file that supports the scene, and the Silverlight JS file that is not only necessary for supporting the plugin, but is tied to the particular version of Silverlight that we're using, in this case 1.0. And that JS file will vary with the version you're using, so it's very important that you have the correct Silverlight.js file so that you're building to the right version. Now, inside the body of the HTML, there needs to be an area where your Silverlight control will sit, and that area needs to have an ID. So we've created a div and given that div an ID, which is Silverlight plugin host. And when this application runs, our Silverlight plugin is going to sit in the body of this HTML right here inside this div with this ID. The way we're going to create that plugin is through a bit of JavaScript, and so you see here a script tag, and inside that script tag is a call to create Silverlight. As you would expect, create Silverlight itself is a method that is implemented in the code behind for default.html, and in this case the code behind for default.html is JavaScript. So let's go look at that. And here we see create Silverlight is a function. it says to Silverlight, create object X, EX. The help files have an excellent diagram of what happens in this interaction. When you say create Silverlight in this bit of script, it calls the function create Silverlight, which calls create object EX and passes in a number of parameters that we'll discuss in just a moment. And the Silverlight object is created in that very position. And that object is what will serve to do all of the work that Silverlight does for your platform and on your browser. So let's take a look at some of those parameters. Now there are a number of parameters that you can use that we don't use here, and the help file lists them all. The first thing that we do is we identify the source, which in this case is scene.xaml, and we see that we do have a scene.xaml, and that's where the XAML or this application sits, and in the XAML we describe how our Silverlight object looks, any animation we might have, any resources we might use, and we'll look at that XAML in some detail. Secondly, we describe what the parent element is. And we get the parent element by saying to the document, please get your element by ID. And the ID that we pass in is Silverlight plugin host. Now that name should be familiar. If we go back to default.html, you'll remember that we named that div where we're going to place the Silverlight object, Silverlight plugin host. And that closes the loop. What we're saying here is the parent element is that div, and that's where it's going to be placed. Now this object that we're creating, this Silverlight plugin itself, needs its own ID, and so we're going to call it Silverlight plugin. These names are entirely up to you. We've made them balanced. The Silverlight plugin is going to sit inside that div, the Silverlight plugin host. The Silverlight plugin itself has certain properties, and we've chosen to set 5 of them. The width 400 and the height 400, and these of course can be changed, the background, and whether it's windowless. Whenever possible, you're going to want to set is windowless to be false, because it will run most efficiently. If you need to set is windowless to true, then you are going to want to read one of the white papers or some of the help documents on setting the background color to reduce the load on the browser and on the machine so that your Silverlight object will run most efficiently. But if you set it to the default false, that is by far the most efficient, and then the version is set automatically for you. Next, you can set any number of events. The 2 events that are expected are an error handler, which in this case we're setting to null because we don't have a specific error handler, and onload. And what we're doing here is we're saying, when you load this Silverlight object, please call the delegate method on scene, that is on scene.xaml, handle load. And we'll get to that method, which is, as you would expect, in scene.xaml.js. The net effect of all of this is that in default.html, in this place right here in the host, will be a Silverlight object that we can interact with programmatically. Now, Silverlight itself, from this point forward, will consist of the XAML, which will describe the Silverlight object and its layout and its animation, and any event handlers, which will be defined in the JS file. So let's take a look at Silverlight XAML. Silverlight XAML is now divided into 2 sections, a resources section and then the rest of the file. Now you will find that certainly in the beta, many of the elements inside the XAML file have red squiggly lines indicating that there's something wrong with your XAML. That's not necessarily the truth that there is something wrong. It's an adjustment while the editor gets used to the new syntax of XAML. Every Silverlight XAML application has a canvas as its outermost layout control, and within that canvas, at least for now, are other canvases and shapes, and within those shapes there can be gradients and brushes, and within the resources there can be storyboards and animations, and other videos will go in detail into how all of that works. But let's look briefly at what we have here. Our outermost canvas defines the extent of this control, so everything is within that outermost canvas, and here's the close. And then let's look within that canvas. We have essentially these resources and then this canvas. So let's look at the resources first by collapsing this. Within the resources, we have a series of storyboards. 1, 2, 3, 4 storyboards. I'm going to separate them so that we can look at them individually. And in fact, I'll collapse 3 of them so we can focus on the first one. So here's this first storyboard, and it's been given a name, Mouse Enter. Now the fact that it's been given that name, Mouse Enter, doesn't, by just naming it, give it any power over the event of a mouse entering some object, but it does indicate to us that this is the storyboard we want to use when the user's mouse enters some object. And what are we going to do? Well, we see here that there's a color animation, and then there's a duration, and this is 1/4 of 1 second. There's no from, so we're not concerned with what color we're beginning, but we are going to, over that 1/4 of a second, this color, the color defined by this hex value. And we need a target, and the target of this storyboard is called highlight ellipse. So we expect somewhere in this XAML file, somewhere within this file, that there is an object whose name is highlight ellipse. We also expect that object to have a property of shape fill solid color brush color, because it's that property that we're going to set, and what we're going to set it to is this color. So we're going, over the course of 1/4 of a second, to set this target's fill solid brush color to this color that we've set when this storyboard is activated. And we can see that if we open up the second one, it's extremely similar. On mouse down, we're going to take 2/10 of a second to affect that same object, highlight ellipse, and we're going to set its brush color to this value. Our third and fourth storyboard do very similar things. 2/10 of a second, same object. Here are the colors that we're going to set them to. Those are our resources, those storyboards. What's within the canvas? The canvas itself consists of rectangles that describe linear gradients and then a final rectangle. Now this gets a little bit confusing, so let's take a good look at this because it's not obvious how this works. This canvas, which you'll remember is within our outer canvas, has a width of 120 and a height of 44. Within this canvas are 3 rectangles, and I'd like to separate them out because otherwise this gets very confusing. There are 3 rectangles and 1 text block. So let's just separate those pieces out so that we can look at them separately. And then of course we close the canvas. The first rectangle has a stroke thickness of 4. That's essentially the border of the rectangle. We set the radius x and radius y of that rectangle and its width and height, 120 and 44, which is in fact the same width and height as the canvas itself. We set the color of the stroke, that is of the outline, and then within that rectangle we say there's going to be a fill property. How are we going to fill that rectangle? We're going to use a linear gradient brush. So that's one rectangle. Then we're going to have a text block whose width is 67 in height, and here is its position. It's going to be 29 as an offset leftward from the canvas. Now, which canvas is that? Well, it's the most immediate canvas, that is to say, this canvas, and 10 down from the top. And we set its foreground color, and we set its text to click me. Then below that, we set yet another rectangle, and here we do something very similar. We set the stroke thickness to 4, and we set its left and top, and we say that too has a linear gradient. And the net effect of all of this is that we've created a large rectangle with a linear gradient, and in the middle of that, not obstructed by the linear gradient, is a text block that says click me. Finally, we create one more rectangle, and this rectangle is quite clever because its width is 114 and its height is 38. Now remember, our outermost canvas is 120 and 44. Here we have a height of 38 and a width of 114. That is to say, it's slightly less. And if we look at its offset, we'll see that it's offset by 3 from the left and from the top. So it's indented slightly inside that button, and its name is highlight ellipse. That should sound quite familiar. That's the target of all of the storyboards. That is the object whose color we're going to be changing as the mouse moves in and out of it, as we click the mouse, and so forth. So this rectangle is going to sit inside this much more complex canvas with its linear gradients and change its color, superimposing its changed color on top of this linear gradient. Now, how do we get those events to be handled? Mouse down, mouse up, and so on. Let's go back up to those resources and note that each of them has a name: mouse enter, mouse down, mouse up, mouse leave. Let's look at the code behind. Now we're going back to the JS code behind for this XAML. And what we find is that in the handle load, now, how do we get to the handle load? Well, you'll remember that in default.html.js, when we created the Silverlight object, we said there was an event on load that called scene handle load. So when we load the Silverlight object, we call scenes handle load. And here it is in scene.xaml.js, handle load. We pass in the plugin, that is to say, we pass in the Silverlight object itself, any user context that the user has chosen to pass in, and a user context can be used in advanced applications where you have more than one Silverlight object to pass in something to differentiate the first Silverlight object from the second, for example, and the root element. In this case, we're going to go ahead and get the plugin, and then we are going to take the root element on the page, ask it for its collection of children, and we happen to know that the very first item in that collection is the button, so rather than doing it by name, we'll do it by offset and get that first item, which is the button, and assign to it this.button. That is to say, assign that first element to the variable this.button. Once we have the button, we can add event listeners to that button. Buttons are capable of listening for events, and the 4 events that buttons can listen for, or will listen for in this application, are mouse enter, mouse left button down, mouse left button up, and mouse leave. And what we want to do is to attach delegates to them. The delegates are going to describe 4 event handlers. Here are our 4 event handlers, and those 4 event handlers are defined by 4 functions. Each of those 4 functions will take 2 arguments: the sender, that is to say, the button, and any event arguments that that sender can provide. Now let's look at handle mouse enter first, and think about the series of events that would lead us to be here. In order to get here, what had to happen was in default.html we had to create the Silverlight object. When we created the Silverlight object, we had to say when you load, please create the handle load delegate. That causes the loading of the Silverlight object, in this case scene.xaml, to call its handle load object, which picks up that Silverlight object, adds the event listeners, ties mouse enter to this particular event handler. So when we run the application, all of that will be hooked up, and when the mouse enters into the area described by the button, this function will run. At that point, as the mouse enters the button, this function will run, and what we're going to do is we're going to say to the sender, find the object named mouse enter. Well, what it's going to do is it's going to go to scene.xaml, and it's going to look for something named mouse enter. And sure enough, it's going to find a storyboard named mouse enter. Remember, that storyboard says find a target called highlight ellipse, that's our rectangle at the bottom, and set over the course of 1/4 of a second, set its color to this value. That is to say, specifically set its target, which is its shape fill solid brush color, to that color. Okay, that's what it's going to do. It's going to find that storyboard, and then we're going to assign that storyboard to this variable, mouse enter animation, and we're going to tell it to begin that animation. So when you enter the area described by that button, this function will be called. It will find that storyboard and tell that storyboard to begin running. And that will kick off the animation that causes that button to change color. Similarly, when you move out of that button, handle mouse leave will run. When you click handle mouse down, it'll find the mouse down storyboard and run that. And when you click and let go of the mouse so that mouse up is fired, this method will run, which will find the mouse up storyboard, run that animation changing the color. But here we put in a little bit more JavaScript, and specifically we've called alert. Alert is a JavaScript function, a standard JavaScript function that brings up a dialog box which will display the words in quotes in a dialog box, in this case clicked. But the key concept to keep in mind here is that you're working with 3 different types of files that are working together to create your Silverlight application. The first is your HTML files, which will be used both to create your Silverlight control and also to create an environment in which your Silverlight controls will be used. And you are, of course, free to put those Silverlight controls into a complex HTML file with all sorts of other HTML elements above, below, and around your Silverlight control. Behind the HTML file is your default HTML.js, which is responsible for instantiating one or more Silverlight controls. The Silverlight control itself is defined in the XAML file, and that XAML file consists of resources, which might define animations and gradients, and also canvases that might define gradients, rectangles, shapes, text boxes, and other objects that you'll see in other videos. And behind that, behind your XAML file, is a XAML.js where you will place your event handlers. So, what you have working together is your HTML providing the environment for your Silverlight control, your HTML.js instantiating your Silverlight control, your XAML file defining your Silverlight control, and your XAML.js where you are creating your event handlers. This is Jesse Liberty from Microsoft. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking with you again.